Thank you, Joseph Finley, for that beautiful music to play us in the room. We'll be hearing more from Joseph throughout the morning. Good morning. It is... Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Can you hear me okay? My name is Raymond Simonson. I'm very proud to be the CEO of JW3, and it is an immense pleasure to welcome so many of you back to JW3. I know from conversations over the last half an hour that for many of you it's your first time back in 2 years, and a couple of people said it's their first time back since Holocaust Memorial Day in 2020, which feels like such a long time ago. It is, of course, the first time we've been able to do this back in person, and it's our first time ever that we're doing this particular event in what's now known as hybrid. So there are cameras either side and at the back, so just be aware of that. There are hundreds of people watching it from their homes, from their mobile phones, from their computers, so a welcome to everybody who is watching this remotely and to everybody in the room. A special welcome to our very, very special guests from embassies across Europe, ambassadors and representatives from the Czech Republic, Poland, Germany, Austria and Croatia. Welcome back to the Mayor of Camden. It's really wonderful to have you back here, and always for your support. And also to the students and teachers from South Hampstead High School who have made this a real tradition of coming every year, and that really reflects so well on you and on the school, and it's a huge pleasure to have you here again. I am, as always, especially honoured to be standing here in front of a number of survivors from our community, very beloved members of the JW3 community. And amongst all of the pain and loss we felt of the building being closed for so much of the last 2 years, missing the regular visits and interactions with our survivors has been particularly tough for everyone. So it was a real joy to see so many of you back here in September, where you were dancing with Ed Balls on this very spot and enjoying a lovely lunch. It's really lovely to see you here. But of course, every year when we stand here, there are some empty seats where friends of ours previously sat, who are either unwell today and can't come, or who sadly we have lost. And of course, this morning, we are particularly thinking of our dear, dear friend, Freddie Nolla, who I'm sure all of you know passed away on Wednesday and was buried yesterday on Holocaust Memorial Day, a few months short of his 101st birthday. As many of you know, Freddie was a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau, of Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, and of Bergen-Belsen. He was a resistance fighter in France, and for the past 70 or so years, when Freddie lived in England, like many of our survivor friends in this room, dedicated so much of his life to teaching younger generations in particular about the horrors of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, and of the danger of racism and hatred. Freddie and his wife Frida were real JW3 regulars, and he was much loved by our staff and our volunteers, especially for his sense of humour and his smile and his warmth and his charm, and we really, really will miss him. And so we dedicate this morning, with your permission, I'd like to dedicate this morning to Freddie. May his name and his memory forever be a blessing to all of us. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Ellie Ulmer, Neil Marcus and Judy Trotter for all their hard work on producing and curating this morning's ceremony, to Gabor, our production manager at the back, for all his hard work, and for everybody who will be speaking or performing throughout the morning. I'd also like to thank our partners, Genesis Philanthropy Group, for their generous support of all the work that we do on Holocaust education and on survivor enrichment. So, please, if you haven't already, turn your mobile phones off, or at least onto silent. We would hate to be disturbed during this. Can I remind you that because of the nature of this morning's event, I'd like to ask you, please, let's not applaud. However beautiful the speeches are, however beautiful the music is, let's not applaud. It's not a show in that sense, it's a ceremony, and that would be great. And now I'd just simply like to hand over to today's host, the social historian and BBC broadcaster, Alan Dean. Thank you very much.
This morning, we will mark the single most murderous outburst in human history, the Holocaust. This was the persecution and murder of 6 million Jewish people, including 1.5 million children, by the Nazis and others that helped them. This unprecedented event happened in the heart of a cultured, civilized Europe, when Hitler came to power in 1933 until 1945, and it took many forms. Many other innocent people were also targeted. These included Roma and Sinti, people with disabilities, Polish and Soviet prisoners, homosexuals, black people, religious opponents, and other so-called undesirables who were killed in vast numbers. What distinguished the Holocaust from all the other horrors inflicted on so many nations was its totality. The Nazis aimed to murder every single Jewish person on the continent and beyond. In 2001, the UK government designated the 27th of January a National Annual Holocaust Memorial Day. The date in 1945, when the horrors of the largest Nazi death camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau, became known to the world. Though today Auschwitz is emblematic of the Holocaust and humankind's capacity for evil, it only played a part in the genocidal landscapes and unthinkable scope and breadth of mass murder of Jewish people and their communities that had lived for over 1,000 years across Europe. We will learn about the past for a purpose. It is a warning from history, imploring us to build a better future. The theme for this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is one day. Within the vast topography of persecution, suffering and of survival, where the turmoil of one-day moment meant the difference between life and death, we will hear from survivors who endured the unimaginable. Then, through a window of hope, we ask them and the next generation to reflect on what one day in the future could look like. We will hear the lost and stolen voices of the Holocaust, honoring them through music, film, testimony, and through personal letters. Today we commemorate whilst remembering, whilst learning. We encourage you, our audience, to create a valuable link with history, to try to understand what made people capable of acting the way they did, and connect this to today's issues of racism, discrimination, and anti-Semitism. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, few could have predicted how the world would look in 1945. From Aryanization to atrocity, the Nazis' murderous intentions did not appear overnight. What developed from official policies of harassment, victimization, forced labor, ghettoization, to mass murder on an incomprehensible scale began slowly and insidiously for the Jews of Europe. Carried out by Nazis, by bureaucratic systems, and ordinary people, including neighbors, the dehumanizing process began with a gradual dispossession and removal of their property, their rights and freedom. Faced with social exclusion, their world started changing in threatening and chaotic ways. Once the Nazis learnt what they were able to do under the cover of the war, they fully realized their racist ideology, building a network of concentration, labor, and death camps. When their purpose was completed, they attempted to hide their despicable crimes, and most were destroyed. Despite the presence of absence, the stories of what took place there cry out to be told. Along with their annual Lessons from Auschwitz project, in 2020, to mark 75 years since Belson's liberation by British troops, the Holocaust Educational Trust sent students to learn about what happened. Tasked with a role to transmit the learning, HET ambassadors Alice Beber and Zach Normington reminds us why we're here this morning.
I became an ambassador for the Holocaust Educational Trust after participating in the Belsen 75 project, which commemorated the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. As part of the project, I had the honour of hearing the testimony of Marla Tribic, MBE, who survived Bergen-Belsen. Hearing Marla's story was incredibly moving and highlighted that the Holocaust legacy is made up of individual stories, not just numbers. One moment that really resonated with me was when Marla said, "I hope people want to know." Her continued reference to hope was so clear throughout her testimony and made me realise the power of being a witness and helping to pass on this knowledge to others. There is hope if we, as the younger generation, continue to share survivors' stories. One key aspect of the project which has stayed with me was gathering around the memorial at Bergen-Belsen as a recording of the song Hatikva was played. This song was sung by the prisoners on the day of liberation and played in the silence of the camp. It was incredibly moving to hear how the survivors still had the strength to sing. The title of the song means "the hope," and the lyric, "Our hope is not lost," reflects how Marla's hope was not lost. I am passionate about ensuring that young people learn about and remember the Holocaust so that we can protect the testimonies of survivors, encourage conversations about standing up to discrimination, and have the tools to counter anti-Semitism and racism in our own lives. The more that people are equipped with this knowledge, the more we can protect the facts. This year's theme, One Day, to me means thinking about the progress that we are making one day at a time. In one day, who could you share your knowledge about the Holocaust with? In one day, which individual story could you learn about? We make progress when we commit one day at a time to remembering and educating ourselves and others about the Holocaust. This is where I feel hope. Thank you.
My journey with the Trust started in March 2017 when I took part in their Lessons from Auschwitz project. As part of the trip, I got to hear the testimony of Holocaust survivor Susan Pollock, MBE. Her words have stuck with me ever since, and they have inspired me to stay involved in this community and ensure that the events of the Holocaust are never forgotten, an ever-pressing issue across the world. The day trip to Auschwitz was incredibly moving, and I really struggled to put the experience into words sometimes. The commemoration we held at the end of the day, standing at the end of the railway tracks, was a truly poignant moment that will stay with me forever.
Hearing individual stories remains a compelling and important record, a mosaic of voices in a memorial of time lost. Listening to the unique nature of each experience, the power and the authenticity of their words, gives us access to the complexity of the Holocaust and the human reality behind the abstract statistics. It reminds us that each one is or was a person with hopes and dreams. These were the moments that were important to them, that they wanted to share with us for a reason. By preserving their memory, we become actively responsible in ensuring that each generation knows what happened. Throughout the 1930s, German Jews were subjected to ever-increasing anti-Jewish legal persecution. The most devastating legislation came in the Nuremberg Laws of September 1935, which stripped Jews of the rights of German citizenship and prevented marriage to non-Jews. Gradually, every area of life was affected. Under the darkening skies and despite the immense difficulties, many Jews managed to flee and escape to Britain, but not before surrendering their bank accounts and belongings to the Third Reich. In many cases, refugees were able to recall their escape and entry into Britain with a debt of gratitude. As former Austrian refugee, Heidi Argent recalls.
I remember when I was 4 years old, I was walking with my father, and my father was a lawyer, and he worked for people who couldn't afford to pay much, and sometimes they didn't pay at all. And we were just walking along, chatting, And this man ran up to us and shouted at my father, "I'm not going to pay a dirty Jew." And he spat at my father and ran off. And I cried, and my father comforted me, and he explained that Jews weren't dirty. It was just a way of saying he didn't like Jews, and he told me that that was anti-Semitism. So that was a word I learned very early on, and I learned what it meant. I knew people didn't like me because I was a Jew. I didn't know how it felt until I went to school when I was 6, when people started calling me a dirty Jew, that dirty Jew girl. And it got worse. It got worse when the Anschluss came. Then the words turned into actions. And I got expelled from school the first day. And my father lost his office. We lost our home. Anti-Semitism became the rule. And we were very lucky, my parents and I. We got permission to come to England. And we were free. Our relatives weren't as lucky. 17 of them were murdered.
As the noose tightened, culminating in Kristallnacht in October 1938, where violence and hatred towards Jews surpassed anything that had happened in the previous 5 years, a humanitarian children's rescue operation began. The government relaxed their immigration policy and allowed Jewish children temporary entry, with a £50 guarantee that they leave the country when the situation improved. Up to 10,000 children travelled alone on what became known as the Kindertransport, the children's transport. As 8-year-old Vera Schauffeld was amongst those children. This was a world turned upside down, where the best choices available to parents was sending their children away into arms of strangers. Vera's story illuminates the immense courage of those parents who said goodbye. In many cases, later, from the very same platforms, they would be transported to their deaths.
I remember so clearly the moment when I went with my mother and father to Liverpool Street Station to start on my journey to England. It was so upsetting to find that our parents weren't allowed to come on the platform and see us off there. There were German soldiers standing at the barriers, and they stopped the families coming any further. So we got onto the train, and I stood with other children. We leant out of the window, and we saw our parents waving white handkerchiefs, and none of us knew that for nearly all of us, that would be the last time we'd ever see our families again.
As the Nazi war machine swept across Europe, bringing it with a full force of death and destruction, some communities actively joined them. Many also watched as their friends and former neighbours were rounded up, herded into ghettos, murdered in situ, in mass shooting pits, or taken away to the east, indifferent to what was happening. It seemed like the world didn't care as a catastrophe took place on their doorsteps. By 1939, ghettos were established in Eastern Europe, a temporary Jewish reservation until a final solution to the fate of the Jews were realised. The sheer terror and suffering of these places was immense. Starvation and disease was rife. Under harsh conditions, the constant fear of the unknown permeated hourly. Every day, facing impossible choices, was a battle of survival. Awaiting deportation, they expected the worst, but not the unimaginable. René Salt was held in Zlunska Wola ghetto before liquidations began. At 13 years old, she remembers that single catastrophic event.
One summer morning in 1942, we were woken up in the early hours of the morning with screams, "Alle Juden raus," which meant, "all Jews come outside." We have heard stories by then that young children and old people are being slaughtered all over the country. So we hid my grandparents and a little 4-year-old cousin in the attic, hoping, fully expecting to come back soon. In fact, it was the last time we ever saw them. They were all shot. We got dressed in a hurry. We ran out into the street, which was already chock-a-block with people, and we followed one another like sheep to the slaughter till we came to a very large square, which was surrounded with assessment and Gestapo, all heavily armed and with large guard dogs. It took a long time till we were all there. Once we were all there, they started giving orders through the loudspeakers. The first order came through that we must all sit down so we can be overlooked better. And then they gave an order for parents to hand over all children up to 18 years of age. To describe the scene is simply impossible. The screaming of the mothers, "Almighty God, help us, where are you?" It didn't take very long. You could see the children running towards the officers, the little ones, the bigger ones, some of the big ones carrying their young siblings. They were all placed on lorries and taken away. While all this was going on, my mother tried to hide me on one side of her and my little sister on the other side. She covered us over with a coat, hoping for the best. It didn't take very long, and they got hold of my sister, and my mother received a beating. This little girl stood in front of this assessment and said to him, "Please don't hit her. That's not my mother," because she wanted to protect her. She ran off with this assessment with tears running down her face. We never saw her again.
Amidst the turmoil, incredible stories emerged of determination to survive against the odds, while ensuring the safety of others. Great risks were taken, and although luck was a determining factor, stories which highlighted the resilience and immense courage of even the youngest of individuals shine through. After all, the Holocaust is a human story. The perpetrators and collaborators were human. Ordinary people in extraordinary times who made choices. As 9-year-old Mala Tribic recounts in the Pietrkov ghetto, by luck or by a brief moment of conscience, indifference or by humanity, a Nazi saved her life and that of a 5-year-old cousin Anne, if only temporarily.
It was 1943. The Piotrków ghetto had already been not completely liquidated, but all the people that were to be deported had been sent to Treblinka. And there were just 2 groups of people left who had work at the factories, and they were, so to speak, safe, in inverted commas. And they searched the ghetto again after the workers had left and found the remnants of still a few people in the ghetto in hiding. I was among them with my cousin. At the time I was 12 and she was 5. Her father had already been killed and her mother was deported, and I was looking after her. And we were standing outside in a column. We were being deported. There were mostly mothers with their children and some elderly men, people not suitable for work. And it was quite chaotic. Children were crying, mothers were very concerned, people were being shot and beaten, and lorries were coming up in the front, and people were being loaded on. And I was towards the back of this column with my little cousin. I turned right and I saw a German officer who obviously was in charge, but he wasn't actually doing anything. He was just watching. And I don't know what gave me the idea, but I stepped out of the column, went up to him and said that I've been separated from my father and brother. They're inside the ghetto. Can I go back to them? He looked flabbergasted. He was slightly amused and curious, and I don't know what he was thinking, but he called over a policeman, Jewish policeman, and said, take her back inside the ghetto. And on the way, I said, just a minute, I've got to get my cousin. And the policeman said, you can't because she hasn't had permission. So there I was with that terrible dilemma. And I want you to know that the Holocaust was full of these dilemmas. But I argued with this policeman, and eventually he actually said to me, now quickly, take her and go back in the ghetto. And that was a real bit of luck, because I know where we'd have been had he not allowed us to go back. Because there is now a memorial in the Rakov forest near Piotrków for these children. And it tells you when they were killed, how many of them. And well, if it wasn't for this German German officer, I would have been there with them.
In a shattered world, where the greatest act of love of a parent was to give their child away, the Holocaust created shadows of lost identities. Many Jewish children were hidden in plain sight and at great risk to the Christian families who rescued and protected them. Some children were so young that even today, with multiple identities, they grapple with the truth of who they are and where they belong. Still trying to put the pieces together, Hannah Mary, born in Lvov in 1941, was smuggled out of the ghetto by her biological parents. She was hidden by a Christian family. After the war, a Jewish couple arrived, presenting themselves as her real parents. Once again, taken from the familiar and loved to the unknown. But these were not her real parents either. Now living in Israel, she shares with us remarkable stories of love, sacrifice and kindness in all its complexities.
One of the hardest memory and difficult for me always to tell that one day, I say one day because I don't remember weeks or months, the couple came to the place that I stay in, with this family, with this woman. And the woman that I thought she's my mother, she say, I'm not your mother, and this couple are your parents. I remember myself, until now, I can hear myself crying and I don't want to go. And they just took me, pushed me from the place that was so good for me. This woman or this family hide me, and they've been Polish people, and they probably much later I was told. They told me that my parents gave me to this family. So the moment, the hardest day for me is when this couple came to took me from one place that I love. I don't know about my family at all. This couple that took me said that my parents, they never told me the truth. Only when I was much older, I found out that by the Red Cross, that these people would not be my parents. My parents would die, was murdered in Lvov. And until now, I really don't know my real name.
Only a small minority of the Jews sent to death camps and other killing sites survived the Holocaust. Children like 12-year-old Hungarian Iva Pearl, who arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau in spring 1944, having been ripped from his family as they were led away to the gas chambers. Now an orphan, he shares with us the enormity of this realization, the anguish, guilt and torment of his one-day moment.
Yeah, in fact, I had that feeling right the way through. When the kettle truck arrived at Auschwitz, we went through the gas chambers, which we didn't know it was a gas chamber at the time. But I still felt this was sort of, look what I'm doing. I'm being grown up and I'm being seeing something other than in my little corner of my world. Until we arrived after the selection and the showers, and some people ended up in the gas chamber. We arrived at the barrack where we were supposed to have billeted, and the capo still on top of the middle of the room, said, gather around here. And he says, you know, people, you've arrived at a place called Auschwitz, don't you ever forget that. And you're given a number. You forget that number, you don't exist. And to this day, that number is etched in my mind. But then suddenly something hit me. I mean, I was only 12 years old, 12 years and 4 months old. I burst out crying. And my brother was standing with further away. There was another chap who also came with us from the same camp. He said, why are you crying? I said, well, I want to see my mummy. I want to see my mummy. So he said, hands on my shoulder, he said, don't worry, you'll see them tomorrow or next week. But I mean it sincerely, suddenly I woke up, I said, Iva, this is not a joke, this is not a dream anymore. This will never happen. And I remember that day losing my youth.
In 1944, the final spasms of the war, the Nazis began a chaotic evacuation of the camps. Tens of thousands of Jewish prisoners, exhausted and starving, were forced on death marches across Europe, were transported to camps inside Germany, including Bergen-Belsen. The resulting overcrowding, lack of food, water and sanitization led to many thousands of deaths through neglect. Having survived Auschwitz, a death march and alone, 14-year-old Hungarian Susan Pollock shares her feelings one day moment of liberation, shares a defining one-day moment of liberation by British troops and her first sense of freedom.
It was an impossible situation for me. I had to crawl out from the barrack and hope perhaps I might get some information where we are. I crawled into the next barrack, and lo and behold, who do I meet? But my next door neighbor from the village where I lived. I recognized her, and so she recognized me. And she said, Susan, she remembered my name. Are we going to survive? And I had the courage and the memory of home. And I tried to encourage her, just hold on a bit. But the situation in that barrack did not allow me to stay. So I crawled back to my barrack. The following day, I went back to see her and she had lice all over her face, which meant she was dead. And so I crawled back. A few days later, I hear shouting. We're free. I didn't know what it means. We've been liberated. I didn't understand it. I wasn't able to walk anymore. And I realized this is my end. So I crawled out. I crawled out somewhere it was an empty place. How long I had been there, I don't know. It couldn't have been very long. And suddenly, I feel a touch, a human touch to my body. And this touch created an incredible feeling. It was a gentle touch. It wasn't an aggressive attack, a gentle touch. It wasn't followed by a shot. And this touch, this human hands, placed me, a wreck. Was there any hope for this wreck to survive? I don't think so. But it was helping me to be placed on a waiting ambulance, small ambulance. I could not get over this. Where am I? Am I in heaven? Am I being chosen to survive? I think about it. I think about it to this day. I think about it, and I've met some liberators, perhaps not the same soldier, who might have done this miraculous help for me. And what comes to my mind, and I've spoken to some of the liberators, what put your mind, you hard fighting soldiers, and yet you helped me with such gentleness and such hope in my head eventually, that it just fills me for life with hope.
For many survivors, now the remnants of European Jewry, the return to life was only the beginning of a much longer struggle, and some never managed to recover. Others, like Susan, possessing nothing but their indomitable spirit, succeeded in building a new life out of the ruins. But the challenges were far from over, and the Holocaust has left its deep scars and erased forever the memories of those we will never know. Amongst the 1.5 million children who were murdered was Margaret Lichtenstein. Margaret's father, Israel, was an activist involved with Oneg Shabbat, an underground group in the Warsaw Ghetto, the largest of all the ghettos across Europe, incarcerating up to 450,000 Jews. At great risk and in an act of spiritual resistance, the Oneg Shabbat members strove to record the realities of ghetto life. When deportations to the Treblinka extermination camp began in July 1942, Israel buried Oneg Shabbat's archives in metal boxes in the desperate hope that the archives would be found. He included this letter, his last testament, read for us by Jason Isaacs.
I know we shall not last. It is not possible to live through, to survive such horrible murders, such massacres. This is why I write this, my testament. I do not ask for any thanks, for any memorial, for any praise. Only to be remembered is what I wish, so that my people, my brothers and sisters overseas, should know where my bones have been taken to. I wish my wife should be remembered, Gela Sechstan, talented artist, whose numerous works could not be exhibited, could not appear in the bright light. At present, together with me, both of us get ready to meet and receive death. I wish my little daughter to be remembered. Margalit is 20 months old today. She has fully mastered the Yiddish language and speaks it perfectly. At 9 months, she began to speak Yiddish clearly. In intelligence, she equals children of 3 or 4 years. I don't lament my own life, nor that of my wife. I pity only the so little, nice, and talented girl. She too deserves to be remembered.
Israel, Gela, and Margalit died during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943. The Holocaust ruptured across generations. It remains an immense tragedy that entailed the destruction of a rich diversity of communities and cultures, each with a distinct identity that flourished in Europe for centuries. It made up an integral part of every country's landscape. Many were destroyed. What remains is an absence of presence, gaping holes where once there was life. The following poem, written by an anonymous author, is entitled The Shtetl, read and performed by people supported by Norwood.
And once there was a garden and a child and a tree.
There was a house, a sister, a grandmother.
And once there was a father and a mother and a dog.
And once there was life.
This song, In the Sky, Unter den Western, was written in the Vilna ghetto. The words are by the poet Abraham Sutzkever, who joined the partisans after the ghetto's liquidation and survived the war. The haunting melody is by Abraham Brudno, who died in the Kluge concentration camp, Estonia. The translation is by Jeremy Sams, performed by Ishin Okada and Joe Finley.
In the sky the stars all glisten, here below I am lost in pain. When I pray does no one listen? Is my weeping all in vain? As I watch the stars all darken, all alone I stand and stare. Let the empty heavens hearken to my broken-hearted prayer. Let the empty heavens hearken to my humble prayer. Take my prayers and take my yearning, these are everything I own. In my head a fire is burning, but my heart has turned to stone.
Natalie Meltzer is part of the third generation, children of survivors who hold the baton of memory, of continuing to ensure, as witnesses to history, that the story of the Holocaust is never forgotten and that we must continue to learn from history.
In 1939, at the beginning of the war, a 9-year-old boy from Gorlice, Poland, lived happily with his family. His father, Moses, owned a flour mill, and his loving mother, Adela, was a wonderful homemaker. He had 4 brothers and a sister. When the family desperately tried to escape Nazi-occupied Poland in the same year, they were separated from his father and eldest brother, and despite frantic efforts, didn't know where they had been taken. In the following year, at the age of 10, and now forced into the ghetto of his former hometown, his 12-year-old brother was shot dead in front of him by the Gestapo. He had been denounced by a former non-Jewish Polish classmate for not wearing the identifying Jewish star, compulsory for all Jews over the age of 10. He ran for his life, having to leave his brother's body lying in the street. He hid for 2 days under a stairwell as he didn't know how to tell his mother. After a year or so, liquidations of the ghetto began. His mother, sister, and 2 remaining brothers, along with the remaining Jewish community, were herded and packed into waiting cattle trucks. There was hysteria. No one knew where they were going. The boy, who had been standing with his family as they awaited their fate, was suddenly pulled out of the group. He was forcibly assigned to a work detail of young boys whose task it was to clear the dead bodies. He never saw his mother, sister, and brothers again. They were deported to the Belzec death camp, where they were sent straight to the gas chambers. The year was now 1942. 12 years old and entirely alone, the boy was sent to Plaszow, a forced labour camp outside Krakow. Upon arrival, the new prisoners were made to stand all night, waiting for Müller, the camp commandant. When he finally appeared, he started shouting. He was furious that he had wanted strong men who were fit to work in the camp, but he had been sent young boys. Müller shouted, "All children out." Everyone pushed and shoved, and the young boy cried, "Stop pushing me." But in the chaos, he suddenly found himself standing directly in front of Müller. The commandant grabbed him by his arm and instructed him to follow. Fearing for his life, the boy pleaded, "I haven't done anything wrong." He believed he was going to be shot, but Müller took him to an office and ordered him to wait until he returned. The boy's heart pounded out of his chest. Eventually, the commandant returned and started talking to him in German. As the boy was Polish, he didn't understand what Müller was saying, but he got the impression that he wasn't going to shoot him, for the time being. Müller told the boy that he was going to be his putzer, which meant his shoeshine boy. Now, aware of his duties, he asked the commandant to remove his boots, so that he could clean them. Realising he had nothing to clean them with and knowing his life depended on it, he ran outside into the main camp, and with the help of an old Jewish cobbler, the boots soon looked as good as new. On his return, Müller was angry that it had taken so long and furious that the boy had replaced his boots with a brand new pair. It was only when the boy convinced him to put them back on that he realised that they were in fact his original boots. He was delighted. "I knew I'd picked the right boy for the job," he said. For the next year, he was the errand boy for Müller, living with him in his villa. He witnessed the atrocities carried out in the camp and how Joseph Müller, a married man with 2 young children not much younger than himself, efficiently carried out his role as part of the Nazi murder machine. He saw the excesses, the parties, the women, the alcohol, the corruption and theft. He watched the frequent visits of high-ranking Nazi officials, including Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, Amon Goeth and Oskar Schindler, and bared witness to the cold-blooded murders. And yet, at still only 12 years old, and at a huge risk to himself, he used his position of trust from inside the villa to help others. He frequently took food and medicine into the camp and ultimately saved the lives of a number of Jewish inmates. In 1943, the new commandant, Eamon Gett, depicted in the film Schindler's List, knowing the boy had witnessed too much, ordered him to be killed. Having made friendships in the camp, the boy was hidden under a bunk by a Nazi guard who brought him food daily. Tipping him off that a liquidation was about to take place, the boy hid his face under a blanket and was able to walk past Gett and onto the departing train. He spent the next 2 years in 5 more concentration camps in unimaginable conditions, too hard for us to comprehend. At the beginning of May 1945, he was forced on a death march along with 3,000 other exhausted and starving prisoners. By the time they arrived in the Theresienstadt ghetto, only 600 had survived. After a few days, he became very ill with typhoid. On the 8th of May, the Russian army liberated the camp and its prisoners. The boy received the medicine he needed, which saved his life. Days later, and he would not have survived. It took a number of months for the Central British Fund and other Jewish charities to convince the British government to take in the displaced Jewish refugees. Finally, they agreed to 1,000. However, only 732 could be found. They became known as the Boys. They were brought to England to begin new lives, but they would never be the same again. These children were no longer children after the loss, intense pain, suffering and trauma they had been subjected to, and they would carry this with them for the rest of their lives. The boy I have been speaking about was my grandpa, Harry Balsam. He sadly died in 2003 when I was only 19, but the impact he made on me and continues to do so is indescribable. He really was a true survivor in every sense of the word. He was an amazing, selfless, kind, successful, intelligent man who, despite all he had been through, always had a smile on his face. He dedicated his life to his family, which for him also included some of the boys. They had an unbreakable bond. As a third-generation Holocaust survivor, and now having 3 young children myself, it is my duty to dedicate part of my life to Holocaust education. It is so important, especially in these fragile times, that we continue to educate our peers, our children and our children's children about the Holocaust. For those who survived and those who didn't, we need to make sure that we never forget, in the hope that one day we learn from the past and take action.
Thank you, Natalie. We are the last generation to hear a survivor. When they speak, history lives. Stephen Frank from Holland was just 9 when he was incarcerated in the Theresian ghetto with his mother and 2 siblings. Stephen's father, who worked for the Dutch resistance, was murdered in Auschwitz. Established in late 1941, Theresian was intended to hold Czech Jews prior to their deportation, but was also designated as a model ghetto, to which prominent German and Austrian Jews, including many famous artists and musicians, were kept in an attempt to convince the world that the Nazis were not mistreating them. This, of course, was part of the deception. Despite the bleak existence and the daily challenges, Stephen Frank wanted to tell a very personal story of hope and renewal. Stephen will be followed by the music of Pavel Haas, a gifted 41-year-old Czech composer who was also imprisoned in Theresienstadt. Initially suffering deep depression, he eventually became part of the spiritual resistance, the rich musical life of the camp. He was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in October 1944 and murdered on arrival. Simon Wolfish will sing an extract from Hasse's Probdena Noc, A Sleepless Night. Simon is the grandson of cellist Anita Lasker-Woolfish, a surviving member of the Women's Orchestra in Auschwitz. First, Stephen Frank.
On the morning of the 21st of January, 1943, it was a dull, dark, wet, cold morning. A group of Czech children had gathered around a little patch that they had got ready to plant a tree. It was the morning of the Tu Be'Shevat, the year of the tree. Their teacher, Frau Lauscher, who had been giving them religious education completely secretly, because this was not allowed in the camp, had persuaded one of the people who worked outside the camp to bring into the camp a sapling, which he managed to dig up and put in his boot as they were marched back into the camp. And it was this little sapling that the children had come to plant, which they did. This little sapling was looked after by these children until they were all transported eastwards to the killing fields of wherever they were going to, of the camps there. And other children took their place. And when they went, other children took their place. So there were a succession of these children, they were all Czech, who went there, looked after the tree, and then disappeared. And the tree then became the tree of the children of Theresienstadt. And it survived. And when the war ended, Frau Lauscher, the teacher, had also survived, along with her husband and daughter. And they then, as the war had ended, were then beginning to show tourists, people like that, around the camp, and showed them what was happening in this concentration camp in the Czech Republic, just north of Prague. And whilst they were being shown around by this teacher, the teacher would take them to this little place at the back where this tree was now thriving and growing quite well. It was then transplanted from this place at the back of the camp up to the front, where the authorities had made a big commemoration ground there, and the tree was planted in among all the other stones and gravestones and things that were there. And it grew successfully into a magnificent 60-foot tree. And it was in the 1990s that a group of people from the Northwood Pinner synagogue visited the camp, because they had been in the Czech Republic because of their Torah scrolls that came from Prague. And their rabbi said prayers underneath this tree in the memorial ground there in Theresienstadt in memory of all the children who had died. And a couple of the people there saw that the leaves had fallen onto the ground, and so had the seeds. So they gathered up some of the leaves and some of the seeds, and they brought them back to England. The leaves were made into a collage which hangs in the synagogue. The seeds were germinated, or they tried to germinate them, and 6 seeds managed to germinate, of which 2 actually survived. One of these was planted at the Holocaust Center at Bet Shalom near Newark in Nottinghamshire. Now, I also was in Theresienstadt, but not at the time that this tree was planted, much later. But I became aware of this tree when it was being planted in the Holocaust Center up at Newark in Nottingham. And its history, how did this little seedling grow into a small tree, and where did that come from? And I suddenly began to realize that this seedling that had been taken to Theresienstadt by this prisoner, that was planted on the 21st of January 1943, which incidentally was the day that my father was gassed in Auschwitz. So it's a special day for me anyway, that this tree was me, a sapling in Theresienstadt, a child, a little one. The seed that was planted in Bet Shalom was my children. And I became very interested in that. So when that tree was big enough to produce its own seeds, I would gather up those seeds and I would take them home to my greenhouse and I would try to germinate them. They were very difficult to germinate, but I did manage to germinate some. And I've managed to be able to plant 6 of these little seedlings in various schools and universities around the country. And they, of course, are my grandchildren. And each one of them has a little plaque underneath. And each one of them actually has a history of where they came from, just like we Jews have the history of where we came from. And that's how the tree came into being.
We would now like to invite Marla Tribich, Renee Salt, Ziggy Schipper, Heidi Argent, and Susan Pollock to light the 6 memorial candles in memory of the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children who were murdered in the Holocaust. This will be followed by a minute's silence where we invite you to join us. cousin Johnny Turgle, who will sing El Malai Rachamim, the traditional Jewish prayer for the souls of the departed. Johnny is the grandson of Holocaust survivors Gina Turgle and Sam Gardner.
Malei rachamim, shocheine b'maromim, hamtzei menucha nechona, ale kanefei hashechina, b'malot, kedoshim utahorim, kezohar harakia mazhirim, et nishmot sheishet milyonei acheinu bnei Yisrael, anashim, nashim, vataf, shenergu v'shenishchatu, shenechneku v'shenisrafu, v'shenigbaru chayim ale kiddush Hashem. B'Auschwitz, Majdanek, Mauthausen, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen, ובשאר מחנות ההשמדה בידי הנאצים ועוזריהם יימח שמם. בעבור כולנו מתפללים לעילוי נשמתם. לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם מסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתם. בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם, אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו ושלום על משכבם, ונאמר אמן.
We are honoured to invite Dame Helen Hyde to deliver the closing speech. Dame Helen is a Fellow of the Imperial War Museum, a trustee of the National Holocaust Centre, Nottingham, and the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. She was an advisor for the government's National Holocaust Memorial Foundation.
I grew up seeing these two photos on my father's bedside table. No one spoke about them, no one asked any questions. All I knew was that I was named after my father's sister, Helen, the young woman in this photo. Then one day I met Judith, my cousin, and her birth mother was Helen, the woman in the photo. And one day I understood what these photos were about, and I realized how important knowing the facts were, how important it is to remember each individual person, who that person was. Without active and personal remembering, without focusing on the individuals, it is as if they never existed. The loss of 6 million is the loss of 6 million individuals, their hopes, their dreams, and their ambitions. So I decided to be active, and this is how I remember. I decided to follow in the dreadful footsteps of each one of them and to see where it led me. I started by visiting the flat in Amsterdam where they lived after fleeing from Frankfurt and where they were betrayed. I then cycled to Westerbork where my family was held in the punishment block. I visited Sobibor and Belzec and lit a Yahrzeit candle where they were murdered. I visited what was the open ghetto in Piaski, where my grandfather was held before being sent to Belzec. I spent time in Nördlingen in Bavaria, a town where my family was born, and I sat next to the Stolpersteine and put their photos there. I finally went to the new memorial in Amsterdam and touched their names. I remember through action, through educational action, I continue to learn and study and research. I teach about many aspects of the Holocaust. We must never forget that these people were not simply victims. They were people who had vibrant Jewish lives. But I ask myself, one day in the future, what will our children remember? And how will they remember? Perhaps they'll visit memorials like the ones in Poland or in Amsterdam or in Germany. Perhaps they will learn about art and photography associated with the Holocaust. And perhaps they'll visit Holocaust museums and learn there. But we know education will be paramount. University and school curriculum, lessons about the Holocaust, the facts, the evidence, but also lessons from the Holocaust. We need to ensure that Holocaust education is updated and is relevant. It includes facts and evidence to avoid the huge reliance on media and internet and the conspiracy theories. It needs to show how the combined efforts of doctors, scientists, architects, engineers can work together and enhance innovations to enable mass murder. It needs to show how unprecedented crimes can be committed as part of normal routine with little questioning. We need to show the dangers of silence and indifference to the suffering of others, and we need to learn to revalue and protect our democratic institutions. Chaim Genot was a survivor. He wrote, "I'm a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no person should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and babies shot by high school and college graduates. So I am suspicious of education. My request is this: help your children to become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, or educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important, only if they serve to make our children more human." And my challenge then to each and every person is to take just one step for the next generation, help them to learn from the Holocaust how it happened and why.
We live in hope that one day the world will be a better, kinder place. It is fitting that we leave the final voices of reflection to our survivors and the next generation.
As an ambassador, having the opportunity to address such inspiring and wonderful people at the Holocaust Educational Trust 2021 Survivor Meeting inspired my hope that one day, mine and all future generations will be the survivors' witnesses, committed to sharing their stories with peers and local communities. By remembering the Holocaust, especially on Holocaust Memorial Day, survivors like Janine Webber, who I was honoured to interview on my podcast, their testimonies will never be forgotten, which is integral in the teaching and understanding of the Holocaust, which helps to combat hatred and anti-Semitism wherever and whenever it arises.
One day, I learnt the perpetrators of the Holocaust were not just evil, inhuman monsters, but rather humans too. And it made me realise that we need to work on humanising the Holocaust in every possible way, to make future generations understand that atrocities can happen from ordinary people, that they do not need an evil history in order to play out mass persecution.
I take great pride in my role as an ambassador of the Holocaust Educational Trust. I'm a member of the Ambassador Newsletter interview team, where myself and other ambassadors speak with academics and survivors to promote Holocaust education. I believe that survivor testimony is truly invaluable to Holocaust remembrance, and I will continue with my work so that one day survivor testimony will be so readily available to the next generation that the Holocaust will never be forgotten.
I've been in part of the Holocaust Educational Trust since 2019 when I took the lessons from Auschwitz. I do all of this in the hope that one day we can live in a world free of anti-Semitism and discrimination. This quote by Primo Levi shows why the Holocaust lessons should never be forgotten. It happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say. Thank you.
One day, I want to see a world where everyone is valued as equal. In doing this, we will begin to see a world that is much more fair. I think that the younger generation are the perfect people to create this, as they will provide opportunities that include people rather than exclude them. With this, we will start to see a world that is much more fair and values everyone as equal.
My generation working together to inform more people about the Holocaust. One day we can experience a society where Holocaust distortion, anti-Semitism and hate does not exist. After being inspired by the courage of Holocaust survivors, I aspire to expand Holocaust education, reaching more people and encouraging them to use their voices, to make sure that the Holocaust is never forgotten, because change comes when voices are raised.
Why do I recall those difficult times that I faced, and certainly my family, my entire family faced? Because we need to look deep within ourselves and be honest and open and say, what is it that people had become? Why have they become so angry, so full of hate, so full of discrimination to such a level, not just for a short while, but it goes back to generations. And ask yourselves, by listening to me, I hope, how can I change that attitude?
For 50 years, I tried to hide and not to find the answers, but I've got to live with it myself. And hopefully the little bit that I talk might get through to someone in the future, and somebody will make a difference to it.
One day when I'm no longer here, I hope that people all over the world will be able to live with one another in peace, no matter what color or race we are. They should just live in peace together. So perhaps the world will be a better place to live in.
I wish that no one, no child will go through what I went through when I was a baby. This is it. This is what I can say.
I hope that you have all learned something today and that you will go on learning about the Holocaust and share this experience of listening to Holocaust survivors and make the world a better place in the future.
I would like teachers to be able to explain to children how difficult it is for people who have to send their children away to another country in the way that I had to come, and how children need to be helped to make friends and to be able to feel comfortable in the classroom that they now inhabit.
It was the day we came to England, my mother and father and I. It was an awful journey. It took a very long time, and we had to get on and off trains, and we were searched, and we never really knew whether we were going to make it, but we did. And we arrived at Victoria Station. And there we were, the three of us, carrying a suitcase each, and we'd left everything else behind. And a porter came up to us, and he said to my father, "Help, help." And my father said, no, thank you. No money, no money. And the porter looked at me and he said, "Oh," he said, "never mind, miss, never mind." And he took out of his pocket a bright, shiny threepenny bit, had been newly minted, a kind of brass, shiny. And he gave it to me and he said, "There you are, miss." And it was wonderful. It was like a gift of freedom. And I've kept it all these years in the same purse I put it in when I was a child. And I suppose the man would be amazed if he knew that 82 years later, I've still got this threepenny bit and this purse. But it was such a special thing to do. It was a small act of kindness.
One of the things that I would want people to remember about these saplings that are planted in the schools all around, these saplings will now be viewed by young children, young people, young students, even the ones at university as well. And when they see the tree and the little plaque underneath, and there's a commemoration with each one of these trees as well within the organization where they're planted, that they will look at that and that they will see that it doesn't matter how evil things are around you. It is more important than ever that we try and preserve our freedoms, and that the Holocaust and all these subsequent genocides that we've had to witness, and people seem to have learned so very, very little from the results of that, that by looking at these trees and seeing these trees thriving, that there is hope for the future if we all pull together and do something to make the world a better place.
One of the people I met that Sir Nicholas Winton saved was Lord Alfred Dubs. And he created the Dubs Amendment, which said that we as a country should welcome and look after unaccompanied children, which he had been himself, and which is why he survived the Holocaust. And I hope for the future that countries around the world will welcome asylum seekers who face death, starvation, all the terrible things that Jews in Nazi Germany faced. And I hope we will provide for them the welcome that Britain provided for those kinder children all those years ago.